Welcome back to the Melons Australia Leadership Podcast series. Thank you for joining me. This is the final in our series. And as we started, we spoke to the CEO of Melons Australia, Johnathon Davey. How are you, Jonathan?
I'm good, Eric. Yourself?
I'm good, my friend. Now we are back, and this is the last in this series, as I said. And to get things started, can we go just back one step, do some first principles here, and let the listeners know why we did this podcast series? And then I can start with some questions for you, mate.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So in terms of why we did the podcast series, over the last 4 or 5 years, we've been working on delivering a leadership program for the melon industry. When it was first agreed, the training opportunity was opened up more broadly. So there were a number of different horticulture sectors who were involved in the actual leadership training delivered. But in terms of wrapping the project up, one thing we really wanted to do was create some interactive online messaging by way of these podcasts to try and, I guess, really briefly summarize where we're at as an industry, but also to start to test and challenge what the future looks like for our industry by way of where do we want to be and how do we want to be seen as leaders? Who are our up and coming leaders? What do they need by way of skills, exposure, training, etc.? Trying to unpack the fact that people may well see themselves as a leader, but in fact, they might just be a manager or vice versa. They might see themselves as a manager and not a leader. If they're setting a strategy or goals for their business and having people come on board and buy into that and drive through that process with them, they are leaders. And so really trying to make sure that we are setting that context, really trying to unpack where we're at the moment and create, I guess, from those leaders who we've spoken to through this podcast, what are the next steps? Where do we need to go? How do we need to structure ourselves and really drive the industry forward and make sure that we're not burning our leaders out. We're not expecting too much, but also for those who we see as our future leaders, making sure that they're welcomed and they're encouraged in the work that they're doing.
The first podcast after we had our initial discussion was with your chair, and he was quite thoughtful about where he thought the lay of the land was with leadership type issues. And he set the context a little bit in saying that possibly currently there's too much of an operational rather than strategic industry focus on a couple of issues, and that there's a potential to develop a better understanding of what operational means versus what strategic leadership looks like. Now, they're big ticket macro things that you're working on, I would say, all the time, just like all parts of ag sector are, including fisheries and forestry. Where it got a lot more interesting for someone like me who's looked at leadership in a slightly different way, a slightly deeper dive, because that's what I'm interested in, is this idea about getting your leaders to foster their curiosity, get them to ask questions and to look at what good and better practice looks like outside of Australia. These were things that were important to him, and fostering and helping to create new visions for those leaders over time. And these are things that aren't unusual to any industry sector, and he was quite forthcoming about these things being important to him. Now, everyone will view these things slightly differently, but from a Melons Australia perspective, what are you guys doing internally to try and address some of those things?
So I guess in terms of that, as you mentioned, fostering curiosity, asking questions, both inside and outside of the industry, we've got a number of different programs. And one of those is, using our new comms platform, which we're currently in the process of developing, as an industry engagement tool. And so the comms program, we've labeled it a community of practice. So how do we start to get people information sharing in a safe, regulated environment, which isn't in the public domain? And I guess for us, the key is going to be ensuring that is widely adopted and used as a tool. It also then presents the opportunity, should people want to take it up, to almost start that mentoring and coaching discussion in a very safe platform where It doesn't have to go down that path, but it can. And for us as an industry peak body, we're seeing that as one of the pivotal changes for us as industry, whereby we hear from our growers, don't send me another survey. Well, if we don't have to send a survey and we can start a discussion through our comms platform, through an app and other tools that we have available to us, whereby people can then respond at their own pace. If they see something that's of interest and they want to get involved, then so be it, and great. So I think from that point of view, you can actually start to develop that strategic leadership role by way of discussing and talking about some of those operational matters. And once you start sharing and really start to feel comfortable in your environment, talking about different bits and pieces, you actually then start to adopt more of a leadership role when you start to create that strategic view of bringing people along with you for the journey, as opposed to just doing it operationally yourself.
It was interesting that one bit of feedback I got in the podcast is around the development or a need for a pipeline to develop people. I guess before you can set something like that up, you've got to give people an opportunity to understand what it means to engage in this stuff and to create a culture that does that as a default setting in terms of developing themselves. And that's going to take time. And it was interesting that you mentioned a community of practice. And that is what I'm hearing in the podcasting that I do with leaders, is that you want your leaders to be self-reflective practitioners. And that means getting them to ask themselves questions about what they're doing. And more importantly, seeking feedback from those that they put some value in. And there's nothing better than that if you can get a group like this up and going, particularly if it's an in-house discussion rather than something that's done in the public domain. And that'll be nuanced depending on which part of the supply chain that you're talking about. But that's not unique to Melons Australia. I think that's an issue for all all parts of the ag sector, and how you engage with that is really up to each individual ag sector. So it's encouraging that you guys are going down that track. Now, do you personally, and you've had a lot more time now since we've been talking, do you see a split potentially between dealing and targeting emerging leaders versus established leaders when it comes to their development? Do you see a delineation there, or is that still too early to tell?
I probably don't look at it that way. Yes, there are people who are already in leadership positions. There's others who aren't, but that's not to say that they can't be into the future. One thing that us at Melons Australia and the board are working on is we've got a very clear direction as a board that we want to set up a succession plan policy, whereby our rules are probably fairly loose, whereby there's no length of time that you can serve as a director. There's no provisions for changing directorship at a certain period of time. So we, as a board, are looking, as I said, to develop a policy to look at facilitating and encouraging the younger generation of leaders to come through, and to not see putting your hand up to be a part of a peak body board as a daunting thing. If you're operating at that strategic level, not getting down into the operational bits and pieces where a board should operate at a strategic level, it should be very easy for people to contribute into driving that vision. It shouldn't be something where people feel threatened by way of putting out their voice and by sharing in those circumstances. And I guess, for us, I see that the way that people prepare for a board meeting is really crucial. If I'm putting together the board papers for the meeting and it encourages a discussion and focuses at that strategic level, rather than me putting a whole heap of operational dribble in there, then that in itself allows that discussion to maintain that strategic focus, and it allows the people sitting around the table to feel as though and engage in the discussion as our industry leaders. So I think there's a number of different bits and pieces in there that we can certainly improve on. As I said, developing that policy towards getting some of the younger generation through is going to be really crucial for us. It's a priority for us over the next 2 years at least, I would say, alongside a constitution review to really make sure that as the peak body, we have the right structure to encourage and enhance our leadership opportunities for our growers, members, and others within the supply chain.
What I do regularly is looked at things like LinkedIn and the amount of training that comes out in the ag sector that does make big differentiations between young and established leaders and trying to identify who those leaders are. I think what I'm hearing from you, and I think it's a really good thing you're doing, is to pipeline talent in industry to put their hands up to be involved in the peak body. And there's many ways that you can do that. Junior boards, encouraging people to attend board meetings that aren't directors, to see the ebb and flow of what a meeting is and what exactly a good functioning board actually does. And I've served on many different boards, and what success looks like on those boards, I think, can depend, but there are some things that you need to move ahead to make sure that you're making strategic decisions, not operational ones. And that in some ways is dependent on a CEO who knows what the hell they're doing. And it sounds like you know what you're doing, mate. And with this process, one thing that I tell people that bother to ask me the question around what is leadership, part of it is it's a process, and you got to work at it to make it better. And I think I would be terrified if I heard anyone say, well, we've got a plan, and once it's in, everything will get fixed and there's nothing else to do, we move on to something else. That's not quite how this works, or what I've seen it work in real life. And giving yourself a 2-year window, whatever that window looks like, actually recognizes, and this is probably one of the last key themes that stuck out for me, was around what does leader development culture look like in Melons Australia. Now, you don't have to have an answer for this, but I think if you ask that question on a macro level, ag sector, fisheries, forestry, what does your leadership culture look like? I don't think we have a unified view of what that looks like. We know that it's important. And if you can agree that leadership is the great enabler, then leadership matters, because we need leaders to help progress the future of industry. Otherwise, why have peak bodies? Why have any representative groups to do the work that your members want you to do, if not to progress outcomes, positive outcomes for industry and the communities that you serve? Johnathon, before we go, any final thoughts on the process and what you'd like to see going forward? Sort of crystal ball gazing here a little bit.
So just briefly, I'd touch on that culture perspective. And I think culture is something that culture comes from the top. It also is something that operates throughout an organization and throughout a supply chain. I always approach things with a very positive attitude, but also with a very strategic attitude. So, in terms of reviewing who we are as an industry, where are we going, where do we want to be, I'm looking 5-10 years down the track. And I know from a lot of businesses, it's a matter of trying to survive the next 12 to 18 months, which in COVID and all of the circumstances that we're being faced with at the moment by way of rising costs, etc. It just there's that need to really foster that relationship between the industry throughout the supply chain to build that confidence in and to grow culture in what we're doing. For us, one of those things that we can do is that succession plan to make sure that the young people coming through, who are our future leaders, but also our future managers, farmers, other people within the supply chain, ensuring that they're feeling involved and included and aware of who's who in zoo from the start. That, I think, will help us develop that culture and share that culture. I can't do it all. There needs to be the sharing of that responsibility. And us as a board, that's where we are, and that's where we're sort of trying to do that. I guess in terms of next steps, well, we've already talked through the communications platform that we're developing, the succession planning policy. Next steps for me is, throughout the development of those couple of tools, I would really like to use some of them to set that direction of where to from here. I'm not a farmer. I'm not on the ground. I'm not, while being a leader within the supply chain, I'm not in the supply chain. I think it's something that we can use that communications tool, and through bringing some of the next generation of leaders onto our board, we will start to unpack very quickly over the coming 12 to 18 months what the future of leadership looks like, what skills are needed, what training's required, Starting to unpack, as I said again, what does that recovery from COVID-19 look like? And I think there's a lot that can be built into that will support the changing of culture and the development of new ways of managing people and leading people through crisis, but also through everyday life. So I think it's a very interesting space. It's been quite revealing, the engagement that we've had through this podcast series with some of our industry leaders. I think it's really started that discussion. Hopefully all of our listeners and members across the supply chain out there who listen to this, really, they start to feel as though there's an opportunity there. It's not all doom and gloom. There is a bright light. There's some opportunity to grow and to develop. And by all means, if anyone is sitting there going, okay, we need some support on some leadership training, or we want to be one of those who are exposed as an upcoming leader into coming along to a couple of board meetings, or having an opportunity for a speaking slot when we get out into the field and do some of our road shows in terms of sharing knowledge and information, or simply through our new comms tool, start to share some innovation and information that they haven't shared before, by way of engaging people in their own leadership journey and their strategies behind it. I see it as a really positive and exciting future to come.
Yeah, thank you, Johnathon. So for those listening, this has been the Melons Australia Leadership Podcast. Johnathon Davey, CEO of Melons Australia, thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate your work and support through this too.
Happy to have been involved, mate. So thanks everyone for following, and this ends the podcast series. Thanks very much.